Okay, so we have really one more topic in monetary policy that we want to do, and it's actually to kind of bring our lecture on monetary policy full circle. So we had actually first started talking about monetary policy early in the semester with our circular flow diagram, right? If you remember, we had that bottom part of our circular flow diagram. Should have tested the markers before class. Where we had savings was some value, and right, remember we had this, we called it banks because we were being lazy, and then investment at some value. And I said, well, this banks actually gets a nice formalized name. And now you can see over the last couple of classes, we've really been talking about banks a lot. We've introduced savings as a type of money. So we kind of want to, I guess, close the loop on it, to use a really common business phrase. We want to kind of come back to this. So remember at the start of the semester I said we were being lazy calling it banks, that it's formally the loanable funds and financial institutions market, right? That's kind of what we want to look at. We know that these banks, this market is going to be regulated by the Federal Reserve. They're going to have the bank rules that put this in place. So we can really tie that together in nicely. So we're going to go ahead and give it a little bit more formal look now. And we're going to look at the market for loanable funds. The market for loanable funds. And I'll give you a couple quick starter definitions. The loanable funds market accounts for all banks, financial institutions, and the Federal Reserve within the economy with the purpose of regulating savings, investment, and money. Again, the loanable funds market is all banks, financial institutions, and the Federal Reserve within the economy with the purpose of regulating savings, investments, and money. Whenever we think about kind of this idea of funds, however, we do want to point out that funds are considered they're still money, but they're a more narrow view of money. So this is kind of like a subset of money. Typically when we refer to funds, we are referring only to the interaction between savings and investment through banks. So it's just kind of like it's a subset of money. It's still included in the M2 money supply, but these values do not represent M2. They're a smaller value because some of that money supply is being used for other things, right? Like consumption and government spending and so on and so forth. So it is just kind of that subset. So like I mentioned, the loanable funds is a market, right? So it is another one of those market models. And just like what we've now seen several times at this point, anytime we see the terminology market model, it implies something about how we're going to build this model. It implies that, we're going to use the laws of supply and demand. And again, the basis of those laws are the interaction between price and quantity. So in the loanable funds market, if we look at, we'll take the easy route first. If we think about quantity, we're thinking about quantity of those funds, right? That subset of money that's transacting through S&I in the economy. And if we think about price, well, we again then we have to say, what are the price of those funds? What is the price of savings? What is the price of investment, loans going to firms? And again, we kind of already have that. We have the interest rate. Now this is where sometimes it can get a little tricky, and from my point of view, I say just don't overthink it kind of with this. Whenever we look at the interest rate in this model, we really kind of consider this interest rate as the real rate of return for banks. That's the formal way of thinking about it. It's an interest rate that is capturing that real rate of return. It's a little bit slower to change. than maybe the interest rate in the money market, right? The money market, we said, is kind of bouncing everywhere every day. This one's going to be a little bit slower to change. They are separate interest rates. And again, if we had kind of an entire semester like money and banking does, we would really carefully work out not only the distinction between the interest rate in the money market and the interest rate in the loanable funds market, but the connection as well. How are they different and how are they related? We don't have a full semester to do that. In fact, now with our sped up kind of lectures here, we don't even have near that time. We don't even have half semester. So we're just going to kind of take that kind of as that it is an interest rate. It is slightly different than the interest rate in the money market, but for our case in point, we're going to utilize the same variable for it. So just kind of keep that in mind. Even though we've picked the same variable, we are showing something very different. Okay, so with that in mind, we can build our basic loanable funds model, where again I have quantity of funds, and I have our interest rate. Okay, so we've got kind of the setup for it. Now we want to think about the laws of supply and demand. So, and then I'll come back to this, so you can just kind of still leave that in your notes. So if we think about law of supply and law of demand, so let's start with supply. I think that's easier. So effectively, when we say supply, we are saying the supply of funds. So how do funds get to the bank? Well, we've got an answer. Funds come in through savings. So supply is effectively a curve that represents savings. By who? Well, we obviously know that that's household savings, right? So from consumers. Yeah, sure. But wait, that's not the only place that funds could get put into the bank. Remember, we're going back over here. Remember, we had that possibility of a government surplus. And we said, hey, if the government has extra money, they're going to do what consumers would do. And we had things called government savings, right? Yeah, so I'll add them to my list. I'll just stay over here for a minute, that way I can do everything here. So we had other funds that could come into the bank. And then we even had one more. Right? Remember, we had foreigners that were kind of over here in our circular flow, and we said, hey, foreigners may have some kind of savings as well, and we had something kind of going in here. We called it NCO. So you'll notice that funds can be supplied to this bank by consumers, by the government, and by foreigners. So I'm going to add that kind of over here. Consumers, government, foreigners. So all of these entities affect our savings function. All of these entities affect our savings function. If consumers save more or less, that affects the savings function. If the government saves more or less, that affects the savings function. And if the government has to take money out of the bank, it reduces the supply of funds available for investment. Same thing with foreigners. If foreigners are taking money out of that banking sector, if NCO is negative in effect, it reduces the amount of funds available for investment. Right? So all of these are our savings effectors. Okay, so now we want to think about how they relate. Okay, so if I just kind of, again, quantity of funds and an interest rate. And let's start with an interest rate that's really, 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 really low. Like it is now, kind of close to zero. If it's kind of close to zero, do you have incentive to save? I guess you have a little incentive to save, right? We talked about the idea of the bank is protecting your money from you. That's some incentive to save. But I probably wouldn't save very much, so maybe at low interest rates, I have some kind of just small measure of savings. Just again, some amount that I'm putting in the bank for safekeeping. What if the interest rate was really high? What if we had like a 10% interest rate on your savings? I mean, think about that. Wouldn't that change your behavior? if you could get 10% on anything in your savings account, you're going to all of a sudden start saying, yeah, I'm going to shift more money to my savings account out of my check. Anything that I have left over, I'm not just going to let it sit in my checking account for a while. I'm putting it right into savings. So effectively, at these high interest rates, you're willing to provide a lot of funds to this market, right? We said we kind of expect the laws of supply and demand to impact this market. And look what happens. If our supply represents savings, you'll notice that our savings function follows that upward slope, kind of like what we would expect. I'm going to just name it the savings function. Okay, so we've kind of got that taken care of. What about the demand? So again, this is the demand for funds. So who demands funds? Well, capital purchases. Right? We expect funds to be demanded by capital purchasers. And who is purchasing capital? This is going to be primarily firms. Again, I know we at the time we made kind of some small suggestions like, hey, there was sometimes customers want investment for capital to buy a house. And remember, we said that was going to just be a net savings. Right? Remember, I said, hey, look, there's money that's going to the bank, and then maybe some's getting kicked back to customers. Kind of the same approach here. We are going to just kind of assume away any kind of consumer home building as a reduction in net savings. So in this case, our demand for funds is solely going to be impacted by firms' demand for capital. Again, we can probably kind of model this out. So quantity of funds, our interest rate. If the interest rate is really high, 10%. Any company is going to be taking out a loan? Probably not. I mean, honestly, I don't think any of you guys would take out a loan at 10% for like a capital purchase, a home loan at 10%. Probably not. So I think it's going to be a very small number, maybe only people who are companies who absolutely require. If the interest rate is really low, again, some kind of indication of what the Federal Reserve behavior has been. They've been trying to push interest rates down. Why? Well, they're trying to get people to engage in spending, not just people, but companies, firms, businesses. At real low interest rates, we already talked about that firms have no incentive to hold money in a bank. So that means if they want to purchase anything, they're going to have to take out a capital loan. And at low interest rates, they're more incentivized to do that. So more funds are being transacted through the bank. 2 points to make a line. Connect my line. And my demand for funds sure does look like a demand curve. We call this our investment function. So I want to go back to my original one that was over here now, and I'm just going to take my two functions that I independently built, and I'm going to kind of mush them together here. So I have this function that represents investment. And I have this function that represents savings. And you'll notice, just like many of our graphs do, they intersect. So we have some idea of the quantity of funds that are being transferred through this market. That's funds F. That's the amount of funds being transacted through by banks, as well as some interest rate, some R1 value. Again, this interest rate here represents the real return on loans, but for our purposes, we're okay just calling it a real interest rate. And again, for those of you who go on, in econ, money and banking will definitely make a much better distinction between our two interest rates and our multiple other rates. So we now have kind of the basis for our loanable funds market. So we want to think, can this market change? Sure. Anything that is going to affect the amount of savings that are transacted in society, anything that's going to amount the investment demanded by firms can change our functions here. So I always like to do just a couple of the examples. And one of them that I like to look at, for example, is that there is a tax on savings. I'm going to go ahead and just start with my, my quick starter graph here. Okay, so I've got my starter graph kind of set up here. We'll pause the video right now for easy download and then come back and we'll make our quick change. It'll all be fine.